Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am talking with Mel Cosentino. Mel has degrees in biology, and she's currently a lead researcher and scientist out in Denmark and Norway, where she is studying the communication styles of various whales, particularly with porpoises, which is where she did much of her PhD research and work on. In this conversation, we spend much of our time talking about the communication of different types of whales. First, we start by talking about the taxonomy of whales, such as toothed whales and baleen whales, and where porpoises and dolphins fit in the taxonomy. We talk about the interactions between porpoises and orcas. We talk about the basics of how whales communicate, memory and executive functioning in whales, how humans can understand how whales communicate, but then just kind of more generally how other animals communicate. We talk about the ways in which various whales will communicate with clicks. We also talk about the environment in which whales live and some of the features of their environment. We talk about the impact of climate change on whales and their environment. And we also talk about the importance of science communication and why we need to have very accurate data with science and being able to disseminate information appropriately. Mel has got a big passion for her research with whales and how they communicate. She's done a lot of technical research on this. She's just absolutely wonderful. I greatly enjoyed the conversation with her and trying to understand mostly a major feature for whales and a specific part of it, not just about whales in general, but really how they communicate and how we still have so much we need to learn. And it's wonderful that people like herself are doing this hard work to try and understand more about these wonderful animals. And so now I bring you Mel Cosentino. I'm here with Mel Cosentino. Mel, very nice to have you on. I'm excited to talk with you about your research. So thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited too.
Yeah, of course. So tell folks who you are, what you're doing, where you're at, what your research is in, kind of your potted biography, if you will, of what you're doing and how you've got to where you're at.
Okay. So I'm Mel. I'm from Argentina, but I've been in Europe for almost 20 years, where I did all my professional career. I came here after the crisis in Argentina in 2001. I did my bachelor in biology in Spain, and I did a master's in marine ecology in the UK, and my PhD in the Department of Electronic and Electrical Engineering at Strathclyde University, also in the UK. And always related to cetaceans. I worked for a whale watching company during the summers during my bachelor, and then I did my master's in a whale watching company in Norway. And then for my PhD, it was a little bit different. I worked with harbor porpoises and tried to figure out their communication calls. And now I'm a lead scientist in a project with a whale watching company called Porpoise Sociality, which is in Norway, where I did my master's. And I'm also affiliated to Aarhus University here in Denmark, where I'm based. And I do a little bit of harbor porpoises and noise here.
Oh, that's pretty awesome. That's really, really awesome stuff. What is the I guess the trajectory? Did you always know that you wanted to study, whales and porpoises, or did it start with biology and then you found your way with that, or was it the other way? You always knew you wanted to work with these animals, and so what was the kind of trajectory, I guess?
No, I wanted to be an accountant since I was 5.
Okay.
That's really what I wanted to do. And then I went to secondary school specifically to become an accountant. And then in my last year of secondary school, I traveled to Patagonia, where we have the whales. And I was like, yeah, I don't want to be an accountant anymore. And so, but that was like a year or two before the crisis. And so by the time I got the money and moved to the city to study biology and the whales, the country exploded. And so then I came to Europe and I studied all over here.
So it sounds like there was a pretty big key experience for you, and that just kind of shifted things. That's interesting. Yeah, I feel like
Didn't even see the whales. It was just I went to a talk about killer whales, and I was like, yeah.
Yeah, it's well, I haven't been down there yet, but I mean, everyone I know that's been down there says it's it's otherworldly. It's absolutely magical down there. So that's a really, really nice trajectory. And so how did you end up in Norway and doing what you're doing currently as a lead researcher and scientist? How did you end up there?
So after my bachelor, I met, you go to conferences and meet a lot of people, and I met somebody who was working in Norway. And I had experience with looking at animals from land using big binoculars. And she wanted to do the same in Norway, where she was. There's a big lighthouse, and she wanted to set up the binoculars over there. And so I got funding to do some training in the Canary Island, where they're specialized in doing this kind of work. And then I was hired by the company to set up the binoculars and do some research from land, but also especially to find animals for them to go. So going up early in the morning, try to see where the animals are, and then send the boat directly to them to be more sustainable, to have a better experience, the tourists, so they don't have to go around trying to find the animals. And that was 10 years ago. And about a year and a half ago, I was contacted by the company again. They wanted to continue to do some research because they haven't done much in the last few years. They asked me if I was interested. I said yes, but I was already here in Denmark, and so I decided to stay here because all the work I do is remote, or most of the work. And so I'm based here. I have my office here, but I'm actually working there.
Okay, so you're physically in Denmark, but the work is in Norway.
Yes.
If for some listeners, when I think of Norway, for the American in me, right? When I think of Norway, Sweden, and Finland, I think of these like kind of three big strips up at the top of the globe. And so for Norway, it's on the outermost, right? This is on the Norwegian Sea and everything. So I guess where is it? All the way up north in the Arctic? All the way up north in the Arctic.
All the way up.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Okay.
It's called Andenes. The Lofoten Island are very famous. This is a little bit north of the Lofoten in the same archipelago.
Okay. So it's very cold up there. Yeah.
Yes. Even in the summertime.
Even in the summer, it's very cold. Okay. And so what we'll get into kind of your research in particular, but let's start with, I guess, some of the particulars and all the basics of things. So I had a conversation sometime last year, I don't remember when, about whales in particular. It was super cool. It was kind of a nice, very overview. So maybe just in how you understand it and then how it relates to what you're doing. How do you typically understand the taxonomy of whales? My understanding is that most people describe whales really as toothed and baleen whales, and then that those are the kind of major categories. And then, so maybe just tell us how you usually break down the taxonomy of whales, and then where porpoises fit within either those categories or an adjacent category.
Yeah, so there are these two groups: toothed whales or mysticetes, odontocetes, and baleen whales or mysticetes. And the differentiation is because those are the first two groups that emerged of whales. So the baleen whales, there's only 15 species, and we're the first one to separate. They all started with teeth, and then they changed. And then within the odontocetes, the first one to separate was the sperm whale, and then we have all the other families. Within the odontocetes, is 10 families, and there's 5 families, I think, for the baleen whales.
And so dolphins fit in where? Dolphins are on which category?
The toothed whales.
The toothed whales, right? Yeah, because they have the teeth. And so tell us about, I guess, porpoises. Or most people would maybe see them as similar to, I guess, in terms of shape or whatever, beluga whales or things like that. But they're different. And are they, how different or how similar are they to some of the other categories of tooth versus baleen whales?
Yeah, so the baleen whales don't have teeth, and they have two blowholes in the head, and their skull is convex, because that's where they hang the baleens. The odontocetes have a concave skull where they have a structure called melon, except for the sperm whales. They have one blowhole, and within the odontocetes is about 79 species. The biggest family is the dolphins, which the largest is the killer whale, which is dolphin. And then the porpoise is only 7 species. The difference between the dolphin and the porpoise is that the porpoises don't have a beak like the dolphins do. They're smaller in general. The smallest cetacean is the dolphin, but they're less than 2 meters long. They travel in small groups, but the characteristic is that their teeth are different from a dolphin teeth. So a dolphin tooth has like a pointy shape, but a porpoise is like a flat spoon.
But they're if you will, cousins of dolphins. So they're
same main group, the toothed whales. They actually appear around the same time. Evolutionary.
You mentioned that the porpoises have smaller groups. Is that in comparison to dolphins? Because dolphins also are in groups as well, yeah?
Yeah, so they're all social. Dolphins are very social, and they can be in groups. Sometimes you can see groups of 200, 300,000 animals. And all species are that social. However, porpoises and the other porpoises, they travel in 1 or 2. Usually, and sometimes 3. You can see 5. Occasionally, like once every 10 years, you might see more than that. But they usually just one animal or a mother and a calf.
Interesting. But they are social, though. Which way are they social? As much as you can understand, are they social in the ways that orcas or dolphins are social, or are they? Is it different? So, what are some of the sociality that you see in porpoises as opposed to maybe some of the other mammals?
Yeah, so killer whales are the most social ones. They are. This is what I'm going to say is based on what we know about the populations in the west of the US and Canada, because other populations are a little bit different. But they spend their entire life together. They travel in groups. Males never leave the group. At some point, if the group becomes too big, they separate into 2. So you have the great grandmother, and all the kids all traveling together. Dolphins, like bottlenose dolphins, they have a system that is called fission, because they spend some time with one animal and then they go to another group and spend time with other animals and so on. So they're not together their entire lives, but they might travel in big groups. How the porpoises, we don't know. We thought they were not social because we just see 1 or 2, but there's new research being done where we do see there's some social behavior. People here in Denmark discovered that they actually hunt in groups, and each of the animals have a role in this hunting. They have a specific task that they have to do when they try to catch a school of fish. But this came out last year, so it's very, very new. As far as we know, that's the only research done on sociality of how porpoises. There's another study done with tag on a porpoise where you can record their sounds, and they found, this is like 3 years ago, and they found that they produce social calls way more often than we thought, and they basically produce in every hour, which means that they are close to an animal at least once an hour. But we don't have any visual data on that. We don't know what that looks like.
I definitely want to ask you about communication, but since we're talking about the killer whales, I think one of the papers you've had, and I know other people have written about it, is some of the behaviors that killer whales have towards porpoises. What can you say about their interactions? It sounds like they can be very aggressive. They can, hunt them. But is there any, kind of pro-social attitude towards them? What is the kind of interaction between, killer whales and porpoises?
So killer whales are, as a species, they eat everything that moves. Basically, there's a record in Argentina, one trying to catch a sheep that was eating algae on the shore. So they will go for everything. But every population is different. So again, on the west of the US, there's three populations that are basically sharing habitat. One is specialized in marine mammals. The other one is specialized in fish, specifically salmon, and the other one is specializes in sharks. So a fish-eating killer whale would never touch a porpoise, which are around in that area. But the marine mammal ones are going to hunt them. In the North Atlantic, where the harbor porpoises are, killer whales are not very abundant on this side, the North Sea, where the harbor porpoises are abundant. So there haven't been many records. There's a couple of records in Iceland, and then there's records in the south of Norway on what were supposed to be fish-eating killer whales. And I saw up in northern Norway, a harbor porpoise being caught by a group of killer whales that were supposed to be fish-eaten. Now we know that was one of the studies, but there's been a few before and after with isotopes analysis that show that actually those killer whales actually eat harbor porpoises as well, and seals. But there were no records. And this is because also, and we would talk about the sounds of porpoises, but the sounds of the porpoises are very high pitch, and killer whales are not supposed to hear those sounds. So it's supposed to have been evolved to avoid killer whales. And the behavior of most of the whale species are trying to avoid killer whales, basically. So there might, if there is any like affiliative behavior between killer whales and harbor porpoises, I don't know.
Is there a reason why they will pretty much eat anything? I mean, there's plenty of animals. There's different mammals that will, only eat, vegetation, or they'll eat, particular types of animals. But why is it full menu for the killer whales? Any ideas or unknown?
They're very good at adapting. They're very smart. They can adapt really fast, and they're generalist in general. Even the ones that focus on marine mammals do eat fish once in a while. And I don't know if somebody has actually studied this and see if when they evolved and if that made a difference in how they enter the environment and they have a bigger niche. But there are animals that can adapt to anything, and they have very different hunting strategies in wherever they are. Like in Antarctica, they create waves to push seal off the ice. In Argentina, they strand themselves on the beach to catch sea lions. In northern Norway, they create bubbles to keep fish, and then they hunt them with the tail. So they're very creative, and that allows them to eat everything, even blue whales. That's
insane. I mean, blue whales is the largest animal on the planet ever, so it's insane that they can do that. So I guess we can get to the communication, and we can get to communication of porpoises. I know this is something that you've looked at. I guess the first, maybe we can start very abstract and then kind of get to this. So we'll kind of take the long way up here. So I'll start with humans first, of sorts. So in humans, one of the ways that we understand, or one of the primary ways in which we communicate, is what we're doing now, right? Is language, right? Some type of language through, or some type of communication rather through language, words and sentences, and just dialogue. And in many ways, language, there's a connection between language and thinking. So there has to be something with what's going on internally in the mind of a human, right? And you could see this in other animals as well. And further, you could say that there's some element of intelligence, right? Language is, not a defining characteristic of intelligence per se, but you could say that there's some aspect in which an intelligent, sentient being using language has some intelligence, although it's not completely used as a definition there. In terms of how marine mammals communicate, so dolphins do this, beluga whales, porpoises, etc. How is this the comparison with how we use language, or is this something different? Right? They're communicating, obviously, and they're communicating through large distances and through time, and they have different calls and things like that, which you can tell us about. But I guess abstractly, is this a connecting point of these animals are communicating with each other with high levels of intelligence, or they're communicating because there's some type of intuition there's some type of thought that's put into it, whatever way that looks like for the animal? Or is all of that just speculative and we can't know it? All we can know is we hear the sounds, they're making certain patterns, and it must mean this or it must mean this. How can we kind of extrapolate that for the abstraction? Or is that inferring too much for the communication with the animals?
I think it all comes down to definitions, right? Because depending on how you define, I'm a big fan of definitions because otherwise I don't know what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. The way we usually define language is exclusive for humans. So what we have for cetaceans, for killer whales specifically, for sperm whales as well, they have what they call dialects, where they have a number of social calls that they produce, and you can distinguish different families based on those calls that they share, and that's only for that particular family. And then they have calls that they share with like related families, and then if there's a different population, they don't share any calls with those.
So the calls are kind of specific to the particular family, and then maybe neighboring families, but then there are some that they do not interact with people that aren't closely related. So there's a distinction between the calls?
Yes.
Okay.
And so we have like killer whales gathering together like different groups, and they share a social call, and then you will see them producing that call that belongs to both of them. But they also have their own calls. And killer whales are very smart, as I said before. They have what we call culture, because they have ability to transfer information. It would be social learning. For example, like killer whales teaches their calves how to strangle on the beach to catch a lion. So that shows a level. Then we know as well that they can recognize themselves. There is some sort of, they also grieve their when one of the members died and so on. So there's a higher level compared to other animals that we know. Having said that, you don't need any of that to communicate, because plants communicate. And so it comes again with definitions. We do know as well that dolphins can communicate extremely detailed information to another dolphin. You can train a dolphin to say to another dolphin that there's food behind the wall inside of that, and it will tell the other dolphin, and the other dolphin will go. But they don't use words. They don't use sentences. We haven't really discovered what the syntax or the grammar is and how they communicate. But they might communicate a lot of information with just a few whistles. and that's it. So their language, if there is one, is way more complex than ours. There's some studies that they try to teach new words. So, for example, you have a ball, you give it a whistle that you create artificially, and so the dolphin learns that whistle in particular means a ball, and then claim that the animal have produced that sound themselves when communicating with each other and then playing with the ball, something like this. We also know that they can, when we talk like put the red ball in the basket on the left and then the blue, we can do this infinite to the infinite, right? As many times as we want. Dolphins do understand up to 5 of these, then it gets a little bit more complicated. But there's an indication that they actually have some sort of recurrence in the way they communicate with each other.
So they can recall certain directions, but then there's like it sounds like there's an ability to kind of have a sequence of events, right? Is what we would call, for humans, we call that executive functioning. How do you sequence, organize, plan things, etc. It's a form of abstraction. So it sounds like they have at least a mild form of being able to do that, right? If I tell you, hey, if you want to go to the store, you got to go down, take a left at the first street, and then you take the right, and then 2 more lefts, and then you're there. Right. I mean, that's probably hard for a lot of people to remember, but, you get the idea that if it's a very simple kind of, plan or conducting something, right? If someone tells you how to, make a sandwich or something, you say, well, you have the bread and then you have this and then this, and you put it together and put this, there's a certain sequence and plan. So what you're saying is that dolphins can do some version of that, maybe at a reduced amount or reduced steps in a sequence, but they can do some element of that.
Yeah, exactly. So they do understand the order of words would be, but we don't know what those sounds means. We know that for dolphins, they have what is called signature whistles, where basically it's like a name of an individual that the mother gives it, and dolphins within the same family have similar whistles, and they use this whistle most of the time, and then they use other whistles, and then they're dolphins, they use someone else's whistle. At some point, I think it was thought that it was like a kind of communication, me talking to you, calling the name. But there's other people that think this might be just contact calls, and then there's just individual differences in how it is made. But I think the consensus is that these are kind of names, and they can recognize themselves individually.
Is it with I guess you could say they have they don't have language in the way we do, but they have a system, I guess, of communicating. Is it just a matter of we can't know it because we're not that species, or is it something where it's just a matter of learning the syntax and the grammar and translating it into, it's almost like I would imagine the equivalent of like an alien language, right? If you, if you had, aliens on another planet and they speak another language, and it's like, well, it's not just like a simple translation, like, Spanish to English or whatever. It's like a totally different system of, but I guess the common denominator here is that there are, these things are symbols, or they're gestures, or they're representing something, no? I mean, whether it's a name, or it's a specific call, or it's maybe it's a directional plan, or whatever it may be, or some kind of learning, or right? That these things are just symbols representing whatever for them in their world, within their system of communication is, or how much can we say or extrapolate about what it is that they're up to with their system?
Yeah, so I'm going to come to definitions again, because this is funny, because I was reading a book about animal communication, and then the people working on animal communication couldn't communicate with each other, like saying exactly they will say something, and then the other ones are like, but what you mean? No, what I mean. And then they will say, oh no, animal communication means that one animal has an intention of saying a particular thing, and then the other animal interprets exactly that thing. By that definition, the humans do not communicate with each other because there's misunderstandings all the time. And I think because we're humans, we also think that we think of the test in terms of what we would do.
Yeah.
And I think that has made studying language in other animals very difficult, because we can only think for us. The same with tests to see if they are self-aware, if they know they exist, and things like this. There's also been, when we look at these calls, so we look at what we call a spectrogram, which is basically the frequencies of that particular signal. And it has a shape. When you look at the spectrum, you can see a shape. And researchers have just used like, oh, they look in the shape, they look the same. So there must be the same type of call. And then you look at the behavior of the animal and go, no, there's no relationship between the type of call and the behavior. But it's the same as you would say that dog, frog, log are the same type of, and they should be using the same behavior for humans. I think that is changing. We're trying to look for ways in which they communicate with each other. I think training, I'm not pro captivity or anti, I don't want to speak in those terms, but when you work with an animal in captivity and you give them specific instructions, like tell this other dolphin to jump, and then you can listen to the sound, then you might be able to at some point figure it out that within that whistle is jump or something else, and then get a translator for that, basically. That'd be great.
I wonder, because kind of with your example, dog and log is there's a few things there, right? They have a similar, there's a certain kind of prosody, there's a certain kind of rhythm to it, and then there are 3 letters and, et cetera, right? But they're obviously different and different meanings, and you can use them in different ways. But I think your larger point is correct, is that, did you ever, I don't know if you ever read the book by the primatologist Franz de Waal. He wrote the book, Are We Smart Enough to Know Animals, or something like this. And it's a great book, and he basically makes the same point, which is we always have a handicap, if you will, because we're trying to understand their equivalent of language, whichever animal. So in this scenario, let's say dolphins. But we're using human instruments to understand a completely different species, right? And so, in theory, we would need instruments that they would know and recognize for themselves, and then translate, essentially, some transcribe or something like that. So I guess it's just we're always at a handicap. But I guess what can we? Again, this stuff is always like shifting and evolving, but what can we say? Like, what can we say? That we know they're communicating. We know they're using it through sounds and signals. Yeah. There seem to be recurring symbols. There's maybe something like kind of like a name, but what can we say, I guess, confidently of what they are doing? Or what do most people agree on? I mean, obviously there's variance and other people disagree and fight about this, but what can we kind of at a foundational space, what can we say? Yes, most people agree this is what's going on, at least now. I mean, that may change 5 years from now, 10 years from now, but what do we know now?
Yeah, of the animals we know, they're definitely communicating. They communicate very complex information. When a killer whale is going to hunt blue whale, they cannot produce a lot of sounds because a blue whale is going to hear them. They have to communicate in ways that every animal has a different role, has a different position. They need to know where the animals are. So that information is in a few whistles. So they are able to actually give a lot of instructions. Everybody agrees on that. Syntax, grammar, nobody's agree. Not everybody does. And with regards to culture, also not everybody agrees, but there is indication in most species that there is a social learning, and they're able to transmit and learn, to teach things from one generation to another that don't like we do. It's not just like fish that they know where to go, where to migrate because there's something within them. This is just learning. And this is in every species. And for my PhD, I actually studied a common dolphin, a female who's alone in the west of Scotland, and she produces sounds that resemble porpoise sounds because she spent 20 years with those porpoises. And there's another, for me, not everyone would agree with this, but there's another indication of the social learning and the flexibility that they have in the sounds that they produce.
It's very when you're saying all this, I wonder what it is about what's going on with these animals that we can learn about other animals and ourselves. Because if you take the evolutionary model, at one point we had a common ancestor with these mammals, and in fact they're mammals of the ocean. We're mammals of on the land, right? At one point we had a common ancestor, so there has to be enough continuity there. I think also when you see the differences with convergent evolution and how we develop kind of the same things over and over in different ways for different people, different groups and different species at different times. So I wonder if there is any, if you can say what does studying the communication styles of dolphins and porpoises and whales, what is it that we can know about other animals in maybe in the oceans and the seas, and maybe with other mammals on land, and including ourselves? What can we what is the kind of the transfers or the crossovers between how we understand communication with other animals?
Yeah, so again, definition, I think communication can be applied for absolutely everything. And we have cells that communicate, and we have ants that communicate. With other animals, higher, like I don't know the word. Mammals like us, I think we need to understand that they are actually more intelligent than we think they are. They do have self-awareness. They have a lot of behaviors that resemble the behaviors that we have. They even have like politics, things that they work. Like males in certain species are not allowed to reproduce, but they are able to reproduce, so they have to stay around. They have their punishment as well for animals that misbehave and things like this. I think the lessons to learn from them and try to see ourselves reflected on this. And with regards to communication specifically, I think we need to better understand ourselves before we go and understand how other animals communicate, and trying to think outside the box. We don't really do.
Yeah, I think the one of the things about evolutionary psychology or just evolutionary biology in general is that it will tell us there's many things about each species or groups that make them unique, but that there are many things that we can learn about ourselves from others and vice versa, and less and less about superiority or inferiority, but that is just different. And in some ways, certain animals in certain places may, in fact, be more intelligent than humans. Just because we have the ability to build rocket ships and go to other planets doesn't mean that we're necessarily smarter. We may be in one area in some ways, but there's some pretty highly intelligent organisms on the planet. One of the things that we haven't mentioned... Yeah, go ahead.
No, it's just that is the other side of that as well. The fact that they don't have hands made us believe that they're just nice animals and they all get along. How porpoises are killed by dolphins on the west of Scotland, and so just because they look really nice and they seem to have a smile, it also doesn't mean that they're not, or they can't be nasty sometimes. And that's something I've been speaking about. People don't really like when I say the dolphins are mean, but we also need to know this because it could be dangerous for humans as well. When we get into the water with them, we catch them in a bad day, and that could be a problem. And that obviously is bad for the human if you end up dying killed by a dolphin, but it's also bad for the conservation of dolphins because they can become for people evil, like what happened with the sharks, and then we have a conservation problem. So this, we need to find the balance between what is actually going on and what we tell people and how we tell people what's going on.
Yeah, no, I mean, 100%. I mean, you know, I've read a few things about dolphins, and you know, I think they're nice, and I guess, or they could be, but you know, I don't know if I'd want to get in the water with dolphins for too long. They can be pretty intrusive, and I don't know. It's a strange thing with particularly killer whales and dolphins. It's like a distant familiarity when I look at them. It's like, oh, like there's a lot going on inside that brain. They know a lot, and they can't communicate with me in the way that I can with another human, and that's even more sometimes frightening. It's like, you know, what's going on? What are they thinking about? What are they trying to do? And they have an awareness. You know, maybe some people postulate they have some type of theory of mind, and you know, with a pretty large animal that lives in the water and has all of this high intelligence, I see that as more. I would be less enthused to just jump in the water and, you know, swim with the dolphins, as you know, sometimes people promote it. I'm more hesitant about that than many other people are. I think you're right. Is people have this idea of dolphins as these like very, you know, gentle and, you know, sanguine kind of characters in the ocean, and it's like, no, maybe not so much. There's a darker side to dolphins and whales, and sure, I mean, I think, yeah, that again, you know, evolution is pushing us to survive, and so they're going to find ways to survive like any one of us is going to, and so, you know, that could sometimes be impact on us. I'm not trying to make the case that these are dangerous creatures necessarily, or that they're, you know, really awful. I'm not saying that at all, but you know, like any other animal on the planet, you know, there's you know, if they want to protect themselves, or if they're trying to you know, make sure that they're not being harmed or whatever, you know, you could see darker sides of that as well. I wanted to ask about echolocation. So maybe that's just kind of implicated in some of the stuff we were talking about in communication, but in terms of the signals and stuff. But what can you say about what echolocation is and how it works, and how it works through water, and how is this the kind of medium in which they're using the signals and sounds?
Yeah, so echolocation is one of those things that conversion evolution is a great case of that. And they're produced by bats and two types of birds and toothed whales, because the baleen whales do not echolocate. And it's basically the use of sounds to check your environment. And then we come again to definitions. Some people are going to say that we also echolocate because we enter a room and we speak, and we know if it is a big room, is it an empty room. We get some information from the sounds.
Yeah. I mean, that's a little bit of a stretch. I mean, I get it maybe in the very, very, very abstract, but I mean, I think it's distinctly different from how animals that we know echolocate, I would imagine, but maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, so then for dolphins, they will use biosonar instead of echolocation, but everybody knows it as echolocation, which is, yes, you need you need to produce a sound that is short, that is loud, and then it bounces in the environment and comes back to you. So the animal needs to produce a click and wait for it to come back, and then produce the other clicks, because otherwise it will overlap and it wouldn't have time to process. So with the time difference between one click and the next, we kind of know how far away they're checking their environment. Then when they're feeding, we know they're feeding because the closer they get to a target, the faster they have to click, because the echo is coming faster and faster. And so you will see an increase in the production rate of these clicks. And that gives you an indication that they're catching a target. So in that sense, echolocation clicks are particularly used for that. There are animals like harbor porpoises and other 15 species that produce a very specific kind of click. They use for echolocation, but they also use for communication. Then we have sperm whales that only produce clicks as well, but they don't look like the porpoise clicks. There are different ones, and they don't look like the dolphin clicks. So dolphin clicks in general are very, very short. And if you look at what we call the waveform, which is the shape of the signal in time, it was just one pick going up, one down, and that's a signal. And that means that it has energy in many frequencies. So they will get a lot of information from the environment. But when they need to focus on something more specific, they're going to make the signal a little bit more narrow, more directional, so they get more details about what's going on. So within the sperm-whales are so cool in so many ways, but the sperm-whales produce the loudest sound in the animal kingdom. They have the biggest head, the biggest nose, the biggest brain, and their click. So I'm going to explain how clicks are produced, how sounds are produced inside the head of a dolphin. So for sperm whales, it's different. For every other toothed whale, they have on top of the skull, they have a structure called the melon, which is what gives this rounded shape of the head. Inside the blowhole, which used to be the nostrils, which is now one hole, the inside of the nostril is still two of them. They're fused. So like about a couple of centimeters inside, there's a structure called monkey lips. And it would be the equivalent of when you have a balloon and then it's full of air and you just let a little bit of air come through. And so they have a system with air at the end of these tubes that they recycle and they can use to produce. So there's pressure, it goes through the monkey lips, and that produces the clicks. So clicks are produced on the right side of the structure, and the left side is for whistles. So this is right in the center of the melon, and the melon is like a lens that will make this click very directional. And then the sound goes through, and when they hear through the lower jaw. They have evolved acoustic fat in their lower jaw that is connected to the middle ear. In the case of sperm whales, they also have one blowhole, but it is in front of the head on the left side, so it will be here. It has a very strange shape. And it's basically because the clicks is produced on the right side, right? It moved entirely to the left because now they have a massive head to produce sound. So the sound is produced in front of the head, which can be 5 or 6 meters long. It's so loud, it comes back and is reflected through this, what would be the homologous of the melon, but it's a different structure. But it is so loud that it keeps bouncing inside the head of the animal. So when you record the signal, you get the first, like the initial signal, plus the echo, plus the echo, plus the echo. And the cool thing about this signal is that actually the time between the echo and the original signal gives you an indication of the head of the animal, which gives you an indication of the size of the animal. So we can calculate how big the animals are based on those clicks. So when we look at porpoise clicks and we compare an echolocation click to a click that we think has to do with communication, there seems to be no difference whatsoever. When we do look at the sperm-whales clicks that they use for echolocation and the clicks that they use to communicate, they are different. So there's some difference in like the energy content, the length. There's something changing. Sperm whales produce what we call codas, which is almost like Morse code. For example, in the North Atlantic, they produce the 5R, which is 5 regular, which is right. And then you have 4 + 1, which is. And you have a pause, and there's a lot of combinations of this. And again, we have like in the killer whales, like some families share some kind of calls, and then there's calls that is shared by the entire North Atlantic. But there isn't much, and they're still communicating with each other with this very few kind of combinations of clicks. And the information that comes in the clicks. When it comes to harbor porpoises, I can explain if you have any questions before I enter into that, because it's a little bit crazy.
There's no questions. There's no questions I have. I just I'm fascinated by the complexity with both the porpoises and then the sperm whale. I guess the only question I have is any of this connected to their brains? It has to be, yeah. So you have the blowhole, and then you have how they're receiving it in their jaw. But do we have? I mean, as you can't obviously put a sea creature into an MRI machine or something while they're still alive, obviously. But I mean, is there any speculation about how this works in the brain, or where it could potentially work in the brain, or no?
Yeah, so because they're mammals, so the lower jaw is connected to the middle ear. The I don't remember which one is, but one of them is ossified, so it's a little bit different than ours, but it's still a mammal. So they have the cochlea and everything. So the structure of the brain is similar to ours. There's still the part that is audition, but they with this echoes, they can actually see an image. It's not just listening. Right? It's an ultrasound. It's like when you get an ultrasound when you go to the doctor. So they get a lot of information from the environment. If they look at a prey, they know the speed of the prey, the size, the mass, the internal organs. If they're pregnant, they can tell a lot. I think there's a group who actually try to reconstruct what the dolphin would see when you put a human in front of them. And they do see an image. There's actually a guy he's blind and he echolocates, and he drives a bike on the streets, echolocating. So because he can see. It's not just listening. He can see images. He can see a tree. He can see a car.
It's so wild. That's it's interesting how much is going on inside the brain of these animals and how they're receiving information. But I guess the thing, I guess this is just maybe just my humanness, is how are they doing this underwater? And then granted, that's their environment, that's where they live, but that stuff just, and maybe they think the same. How do these, land mammals do this stuff out of water, right? Maybe that's the same for them, but I don't know, that's insane to me to think that. But again, I mean, we live on land as humans, so, but it's probably very natural and normal for them, obviously, but it's insane to think that that's how you communicate through water.
Yeah, so sound travels much faster in water than it does in air. So that's why most of marine animals use sound to communicate. But the whole system is inside the head. So they use this air that they actually have recycled inside their head.
Yeah.
So they carry their own air to do this. They have lungs, but they can't, when they dive deep, like the sperm whale can go 2,000 meters deep. So before, yes, it's like
so deep. Oh my gosh, so far.
There's another species that can go like 3,000, which is insane, like 3 hours without breathing.
That's insane.
But when they do this, they have to get rid of all the air in their lungs, because otherwise it would go into the blood and they would get the bends. And so you see them like expelling all the air and they're going through. But they have to keep this little bit for producing clicks. And at some point they have to recycle it. So when it goes through to make a sound, it goes somewhere else and then it needs to go back to where it was in order to continue doing this. It's really, really
it's
cool.
Incredible. Yeah, it's incredible. You were going to tell me about how porpoises do this, yeah? You were about to tell me about this.
And so it also happens in dolphins that not only they have these whistles, they also have what we call burst pulses, which is basically a lot of clicks in a very short period of time. But they haven't been studied a lot in dolphins. And again, when we studied this, it's like, okay, I see a lot of clicks and it looks on this frequency, whatever. It's this type of goal. So for harbor porpoises, they produce these clicks that we call them narrow band high frequency, because the energy is concentrated in a very narrow band. And its high frequency is over 100 kilohertz. We can hear up to 20. I can hear only up to 10, more. But it's way over what we can hear and most animals can hear. And when we look at the echolocation clicks, it looks exactly the same as when they do this burst pulses. There's no difference. The frequency is the same, the length is the same, the shape is the same. So how is it possible they transmit any information if everything is the same? Mm-hmm. So there was a couple of studies here in Denmark. There's a few animals in captivity, and they do a lot of work with connected to the university. And they do a lot of work with physiology, sound production, hearing, and all of this. And there were 3 studies looking at this communication calls. One in the 60s, one in the 90s, one in the 10,000s, 2010s. And yes, they produce this, a lot of clicks in a very short period of time. You have repetition rates, 200 clicks per second, 500 clicks per second, up to 800 clicks per second, 1,000 clicks per second. And what they did was just look at the animals interacting with each other and figured out whether these calls correspond to any particular behavior. But they did find, for example, some calls that seem to be produced during mating, some calls that were produced during aggressive behavior, some calls between mother and calves. But there hasn't been any study in the wild, and this is how my whole PhD started. I was given data by an organization called the Clyde Porpoise. I was like, okay, I have all this acoustic data. I was collected through systematic surveys on the west of Scotland from a boat with 4 hydrophone, which is just microphone for the water, towed in the back. And this information is usually used for because you get GPS and then you can detect the animals, and you know how many have detected in different areas. You can look at densities and distribution, and if there's any changes in season and so on. And there was somebody using that data for that particular thing. So he was like, okay, you can use this data to do whatever you want, but you can't do this particular thing. Like, okay, then I'm going to try to do communication and see if I can find this calls that they do see in captivity. And when I started reading, there's a device they have been used for about 30 years where they record not the sound that is produced in the environment, but the information about the sound. So when it happened, how long it was,
Mm.
the frequency that it had.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it is specifically to monitor harbor porpoises here in the north. And the other species that produce the same. So at the end, you get like a lot of tables, and it tells you there was a porpoise here at this time. So you don't get to see the actual signals themselves. And in 30 years of use, not a single social call recorded.
Really?
Yes, except for one time, because they had the porpoise right there. They were strapped somewhere, and they put the recorder, and then they look at the recording. They found this calls 200 kilohertz or something, 200 clicks per second. And that was it. So how is that possible? Like, they have to communicate. We have to make activity. We see them. They're definitely communicating. And so then I realized it was just a matter of the technology that we had. Because you have so many clicks per second, 600 clicks per second, when you have a system that is just extracting information about every sound, it might just be difficult to get 600 clicks in a second and get all this information. And then you don't get to see these patterns. The algorithm that it is in these devices, we don't know how it works, but that's what we imagine, that there's something that doesn't allow it to get all of this. So there's a software available that everybody uses for detections. And I tried to use that, but it also didn't work because you need like different steps. First, you need to find the sound that might be a porpoise. Then you have to classify it into whether it is a porpoise or just noise. And then you have to put them all together to try to see if there's any pattern in this. And so this software had a classifier, but it didn't actually find all the clicks. And so you couldn't see a pattern. You could see something was missing, especially the really high repetition rate. So I ended up doing my own algorithm and my own software to study the communication porpoises. So after I did all of this, and I found a way to get as many clicks as possible, even if I had a lot of false alarms. And then I have an algorithm that kind of removes the things that don't seem to belong to whatever pattern is in there. And when I did this, I found hundreds of different calls. Wow. This was with the actual recordings, now with the other device, so it records everything. But then I see patterns like these 200 clicks per second, they appear a lot. This 500. There's others like go from 20 clicks per second to 700 clicks per second, or from 700 down. And I found V-shaped, and I found what was called phrases, which is the same call repeated a few times. So like going down from 100 clicks per second down to 0, and then again and again and again. So before, there was a lot of discussions about what would be feeding. Do we say that when it's 100 clicks per second, it's just feeding? Do we use that and then we analyze the data saying the animals are feeding? And then you have this social calls. There are 100 and more and less, and it's just a mess. So now we need to figure out when those calls are produced and if any of them are actually feeding, and if there is a difference in the patterns that we see when they're feeding, because they feed in the bottom of the sea in shallow waters and also on the surface. So can we tell from these patterns if they're feeding in different places? Can we see if there's a baby? What can we see in these patterns? But I finished my PhD in 2020, and there's people using it now, this software. I haven't used it myself yet, not for that. But yes, so that's what's coming now, trying to figure out what these patterns mean. That's how they transmit information with these cute patterns.
It's very innovative of you to say, hey, these machines aren't getting the data that we need, so I'll just make my own. So that's very innovative. That's why they pay you the big bucks, right?
Not really.
That's a super helpful contribution. It must be also interesting too if other people are using it, people that are in this world, and they're analyzing this data. Then you can potentially understand more, for more people using it in other places. It's not just with you. So that's also really, really cool. It'll be interesting to see what comes out of it. Because obviously something's going on. If you have all these clicks per second, my goodness, maybe they're more talkative than humans are. So, that's a lot going on. There's a lot going on. So it's super fascinating.
Yeah. So my hope is now to get some data of the animals that they carry the tags, and then try to see if I see the same patterns. Because the type of data that I had is just device that you just put on the water for 2 months and then you recover. So there's no actual information on what's going on, which animals are there, and if they're male or female. So it's all coming, hopefully.
Yeah. I think in some of your papers you talk about the environment. So we haven't really talked about that. So we talked a little bit about their social behavior. We talked about communication a lot. We talked about kind of how they're the taxonomy, but I guess maybe we can talk a little here about the environment in which they live. So, where where on the planet do these animals live? Do they just, if there's water, they live there? Or I should say oceans, they live there, or is there just some places they don't? If I look at a globe, right, and I say, okay, where are whales and dolphins, and is it always North Atlantic, Southern Ocean, Pacific, or there's some places they just don't? They're just everywhere. Everywhere there's water. Okay. I guess what are the major places? So you're up in the north, right? Way, way, way up in the north, and then I know people spend a lot of time down in the Southern Ocean by Antarctica. Are there particular? And I know all up and down the Pacific too, but is there kind of, I guess you could say, I don't want to say hot spots, right? But kind of these areas where they kind of tend to concentrate, whether it's whales or porpoises or dolphins, where they kind of locate around?
Yeah, so it depends on the species, obviously. Baleen whales tend to do this seasonal migration between low latitudes and high latitudes. And so it depends on which season you go in. You might see them here or there. Most toothed whales, you can find them in the continental shelf because those are very productive waters. So they're usually there, or in places where there's upwelling. So whether either the current produces this waters from the bottom to come with a lot of nutrients, and so the waters are productive as well. And then we have species they call beaked whales because they all have a very long beak. There's 23 species. Some of them have never been seen alive. They're very rare, and they live offshore. They dive. These are the ones that I mentioned before, 3 hours breathing 3,000 meters. We don't really know much about them, but they live offshore. They're far away. Then when we see them, there are a few places where you can see them close to shore because like volcanic mountains, there's no continental shelf, and so you get to see these animals very close. And then sperm-whales, which is the species that we have there in Andenes, in northern Norway, they're also deep divers, so you won't see them close to shore. They usually where the continental shelf ends at the edge, because that's where it becomes deep. And so if you follow that with your boats, you're likely going to see them along those. Or in the Strait of Gibraltar, for example, as well, like the entrance is very deep, and so you will see them there. Some part of the Mediterranean. Dolphins might move a little bit more. It depends on the prey, where they are. Killer whales, you can see them like literally stranding on your beach. And so the sperm whales, which is the interesting case for me. harbor porpoises are only in the north, and we thought they were always in like shallow waters because the North Sea and the Baltic and is not so deep. And then somebody put a tag on a porpoise in West Greenland, and they found them just going offshore and diving 400 meters, which is absolutely insane. So we don't really know if they actually also are offshore doing crazy stuff. But so the sperm whales, they're born in warm waters around the Azores and Madeira and so on. And then the males and the females and the calves remain in those waters year round. But then the males, when they're about 10 years old, they start migrating to the poles, either north or south. So when they get to northern Norway, they're already alone males. It's just hanging out there on their own. And the reason why we can see them there is because there's an underwater canyon. They're very close to shore. It's the closest to shore in Europe. It's only 15 kilometers from land. And so it's not only just sperm whales over there, but there's a lot of other species because it's extremely productive. So you have the Gulf current coming up, and so it produces upwelling, and you can also see this crazy other species that are very difficult to see, but killer whales and fin whales, and we have porpoises up there as well, a lot. So you need production, primary production, and that would attract fish or squid in the case of certain species. You'll get to see them.
Is most of the migration, that they're doing mostly because of just food? We're following wherever the food is, right? Or is it sometimes with the climate, so warmer waters here, colder, whatever the environment is, or is it just following the food chain, or what is the, I guess, reasons for why they're in certain places? So you can talk about the ones in northern Norway if you want, or anywhere else. What is the, I guess, major function for staying in those locations?
So it depends again on the species. Like harbor porpoises cannot not eat for 3 days. They would die of starvation. And then you have other animals that can be 3 months without eating. And so it is the main hypothesis that we have to explain this long migration between different areas of baleen whales is avoiding killer whales. So there are less killer whales in the north, which is more productive waters. So what the animals do is that they are in their summer times, they're in the colder waters, and then they go in the winter to mating areas in warm waters where there are not so many killer whales. So that makes them do this long migration. So it might be an adaptation that they stop eating for so long to do this. Then we have animals that migrate, like porpoises also migrate within like the Baltic as well. The Baltic gets really cold, and some areas you have ice, and so the animals move south. So that's just not about food, it's just avoiding being trapped in the ice. And then we have killer whales in Antarctica. They do a long migration to warmer waters to molt, basically. They accumulate a lot of cyanobacteria. That's why they're so yellowish in Antarctica. And to get rid of them, they basically go to Brazil and get rid of them and then come back. So there are many reasons why they move around. But we have, like, harbor porpoises, we have this one close to here. She comes every single day to the same spot. And every single year she has a baby in that spot. And then she comes back again with, like, so we don't, there's a lot of variation on this.
That's super fascinating. I know I think it's the blue whale. Is that right? I could be wrong on this. I know that in terms of longevity, they live quite a long time. I think blue whales can live up to 120 years. I think at the very limits of it. I think usually it's mostly 60, 70, 80 is not unheard of. And I believe that's partly due to because the larger the animal, the less energy is being expended. So, you're able to not use as much and you can live longer, right? And so, but is I guess just kind of tell me about if they're doing all this migration, all this movement, does it impact any of their life expectancy or things like, obviously you want to keep out of harm's way. You don't want to get eaten by the killer whales and things like this. But in terms of, I guess, their longevity or their quality of life, how does it, as best we can tell, work for them?
Yeah, you actually had a conversation with somebody about this, like the scaling. And yes, the bigger animals.
Yes, with Jeffrey West. Yeah.
The larger animals, they live longer. The longest lived, or whatever the term is, of whales is the bowhead. Was up in Greenland, 250, 300 years is estimated.
Goodness. Oh wow!
Like they found one with the harpoon from the 1800s, still alive.
Oh my goodness!
And then you have the porpoises. They live like 12 years, 10 years. And in other places 5 years, and they need to eat all the time. So you do see that, and so climate change actually could impact this. If we have animals that only eat 3 months a year, and then when they get there, there's nothing to eat. I don't know how the situation is actually in the north. I know that there's some evidence that the current is already stopping. Or is not stopping, but is delaying, and in a few 100 years maybe we don't have that current anymore, and then the waters are not going to be productive. But we also have the opposite. Herring, I don't know if it's related to climate change because we don't know. Herring has a massive movement around the North Atlantic where they spend different life cycles in different parts, and once in a while it just moves. And in 2011 they moved to the north, and then we see like 500 kilowatts together, just eating together with fin whales and humpback whales. And I was reading a paper today about this. Was it Hubbard Porpoises? I think it was. That because of this in Greenland, there was a shift that brought a lot of cod, and the animals just got a lot better in body condition and weight, and compared to years before where they were feeding on something else. So they stay longer and they fed better. So we don't really know, but some changes are going to be there for sure.
No. I was going to ask about this. I first was going to ask about what is the human interaction, or what is the impact of human interaction on marine mammals such as whales and dolphins and porpoises, and then connected to that about the impact of climate change, which is sort of connected. So I think in a few of your papers you've written about the aspects of whale watching, right? And then even in certain countries, such as Iceland, they have this industry of whaling, which is the way I understand it is that it's a kind of a mixed thing. I think that there's an element of care and concern that's involved, but at the same time, people try to have some limits on that, and so there's it's a messy kind of situation, because I know there's a long history with that. So I guess just maybe in general, you can just start with what is the impact of human interaction, whether it's just observing or hunting or maybe some types of conservation aspects, which just kind of the human involvement or the impact of human interaction involvement with these animals.
Yeah, so the biggest threat to whales and dolphins in general is fishing nets. There's estimated 300,000 animals dying every year on fishing gear, either active ones or just what they call ghost, which is nets that people are lost and then the animals get trapped in this. Whaling has an impact, a lot less than 300,000 a year. So the International Whaling Commission, which is a body that regulates the hunting of whale and many other topics, I studied in the 40s when the whaling countries realized that they needed to figure out how many animals there were before they continued to hunt as they were. And they put a moratorium in 82. They started in 86, where commercial whaling couldn't go on. So if you were a member of the IWC, you couldn't go on. But there were exceptions on this. You could do research. Like if you needed to kill an animal for research purposes, you could kill it and then you can sell the meat. So for example, if we wanted to see stomach content of species that don't usually strand, then the only way is that you hunt them and then you see the stomach content. So Japan was doing this. And then there's another way, which is, I don't recognize your moratorium and I just continue whaling. And this is what Norway does and Iceland does as well. And this is quotas, like in Norway is highly regulated. They have very small quotas, about 400 animals a year. It changes every year. And they don't always fulfill this quota. In Iceland, it's a little bit more messy because they go after whales that are vulnerable in the conservation status. They go for fin whales. In Norway, it's minke whales, and the population seems to be doing okay. I don't want to talk about the ethical parts because I work for a company who has a neutral position on this.
That's fair.
But yes, it's regulated. Then we have noise as is a big threat to animals in different ways. They can actually kill them directly, like explosions. They can kill the animal if it's too close. Then we have there was a few cases with these animals that dive really deep. The big whales, sonar are very dangerous for them. So what seems to happen is that the animals, I mentioned before, that they need to expel all the air before they dive, so they don't get the bends. Apparently, the sonar, particular frequencies, the animal gets so scared that they actually come up really, really fast. They do need to do this decompression, like divers do. But because they're so scared, they come up really fast, and then air goes into the blood and they die of this. Other animals respond by, they stop feeding, for example. So if there's a lot of sonar going on, because or some activity, the navies, then might interrupt these animals, or they can distract them and then they get entangled in fishing gears, or they can make them go another route. In 2016, there were more than 40 strandings of sperm whales. Sperm whales, when they migrate to the north from the Azores, for example, they don't go into the North Sea because it's very shallow. They will go on the other side. And there's some indication that there was some sonar activity going on. The Navy was there. And so they went into the North Sea and they basically all died because they couldn't feed, couldn't go. And then we have, which is probably the biggest problem with noise, is masking, which is when the noise interferes with their ability to communicate. And the animals that use echolocation, their ability to find a prey, because if there's noise, they cannot hear the echoes. And whale watching will fall into this category. Obviously, ship strikes is another problem, especially for big whales. There has been some cases of whale watching, but very bad managed whale watching boats going striking an animal. But with whale watching, it's been shown all over the world, basically, that the animals change their behavior when they're around, when the boats are around. there's a lot of guidelines, luckily, because we have found that there are certain behaviors that the boat can do that actually minimizes a lot this impact. Also depends on the population. If there's a population that is not used to having boats around, they're going to be more impacted because they're going to be scared every single time. If you are in the Strait of Gibraltar, where there's 90,000 boats buzzing every year, the animals are just there. They come to you. They might still be impacted with pollution. They still have masking. But they're not responding. Obviously, in an obvious way, which they might have chronic stress, they might not be able to reproduce, they might have health issues, but you're not going to see them responding in their behavior. And this is where we need to figure out how to study the impact of our activities on the animals. Are we going to look at the behavior? And then if the animal doesn't respond, I'm assuming that the animal is okay, but in reality, it's so stressed that it can't even respond anymore. Yeah. So there's been a lot of work on looking at cortisol levels and doing other type of research to figure out the impact of whale watching. I did my master's in the company that I work for now, and they started in '87. At the time, nobody knew there was sperm whales over there. It was a group of scientists and people who liked whales. And they had scientists all the time on board, and they were looking at the behavior of the animals from the beginning. So in the case of the sperm whale, they dive for half an hour, and then they come to rest for 8.5 minutes. And this is all they do. These are solitary males. They dive and they rest. They dive and they rest. And so when they are resting and you disturb them, what they do is it's called a shallow dive, when they just go underwater, move a little bit away from you. When they're going to do a deep dive, they take the fluke out of the water entirely because they need to be vertical and they go down. So when they do this shallow dive, it doesn't even show the tail, it just moves away. So when they started with the activity, they had like 90% of the animals would do these shallow dives. But then over the years, they got better and better and better. And now the animals, you might get 2 or 3 shallow dives a season because an animal is particularly upset for something. They also have it like their boat it's quite silent, but it also depends on the boat. If you have a ferry going through, that upsets anybody. Yes, actually, porpoises can hear them like 7 kilometers away. They're already reacting to a ferry coming. So, yes, there's so many ways in which we disturb these animals. But there's hope. I think there's a lot of things that we can do, and I think I like working with whale watching companies because it's an opportunity to do good stuff. Like you use the platform to teach people as well about the animals. So hopefully they actually go back and they start doing something to protect them.
Yeah, I mean, you've really outlined a lot of challenges that are there, and you know, I take it to one of these things where I see a few things here with this is, you know, I mean, we don't own the planet, you know, we cohabitate the planet with other, you know, animals. And while we're quite populous, there are, you know, other multicellular organisms at best that we can, or at the least that we should respect and respect their home as much as it is ours. I remember when I was on the Galapagos Islands, and it's very strict. And, you know, that never gave me any pause. I never really had any problems with it because it's such a unique place. It's very special. And, you know, it felt really like you were in their home. It's their home. You're the visitor. And that's really what it is. And don't, it's very, very strict on how you dispose of waste and recycle, and you cannot touch the animals. You don't want them to have interactions, and unfortunately, many people do. And the temptation is obviously there, but it's just some unique animals. But it's and they have many guidelines, and I think it's right. I think it's right to do. And I know some organizations and foundations have worked hard to have really good guidelines and restrictions. I know there's been lots of work in the Southern Ocean in particular. And so I think that's super essential. But, one of the other problems here is that, even if you take a big country like the United States, let's say, the United States could have really, really good conservation efforts and restrictions, but is China going to do that? Is India going to do that? Is Japan going to do that? And that's where it gets really tough, because these are, India and Japan or China are bigger in terms of size and population. Russia is bigger in terms of size, and that's what makes it really tough is places that are bigger than some countries, more people than some countries, and they might not really care, or care less, or have different restrictions or whatever. And it sounds like there's more work to do. I guess the other question here as well is what about the impact of climate change? So of course, the planet's always evolving. The climate's always changing. It has been for 4 billion years. We're I think technically still in an ice age. Is that correct? I think I'm right. I think I'm right on this. Technically, in terms of the big period scales or whatever. But we have all of these. The climate's always changing, but obviously it's been exacerbated by human involvement. So I guess just in terms of environments and where these animals live, especially with ocean acidification, warming of the ocean, how much CO2 is in the ocean, etc. How much is the very rapidly changing climate impacting the environments and the homes of many of these animals?
Yeah, before I go into that, I wanted to mention something else that I worked on. You were talking about the different countries, but also different cultures and how they see animals. I don't know where I'm from at this point, but we do love whales and we want them to survive. But we have other cultures where they eat them, and we have places where they eat them because they don't have any food. And so I did some work on this, which is called Wild Meat. And there's a paper coming out now, where dolphins are eaten by a lot of cultures all around the world. And in some places they do it very sustainable, because they do it for religious reasons. They only catch animals that are stranded on the beach. In other places they just catch them and use as bait for catching something else. So every place is very different, and it's very important to understand the culture that you trying to, I don't know which word to say to be politically correct, that you are working with to prevent those killings, or what is happening is very varied. Like where I work in Norway, the same grounds where you do whale watches is where they do whaling. And so they actually live together, the two activities. And yes, climate change, as you mentioned, acidification. And my biggest concern is what would be mismatch, where we sit here on land with plants, where we have 2 weeks of really nice weather in January, and then all the plants flower. When it's springtime and they have to flower again, they cannot flower again, so the insects are not going to be there to pollinate them, and there's going to be no food for birds, etc. So the same can happen in the oceans. If there's some event that either make forces a migration, for example, the spawning season, which attracts a lot because all the fish get together to spawn, and that attracts a lot of different species. If that happens in a different period when the whales are coming, there's no food anymore. And I think that is the biggest danger of climate change at the moment. And at some point, in some place, the entire food web is gonna crash. Hopefully, no. I still work as if my work is gonna help. Not happening, but yes. I always talk about climate change as the inflation. I come from a country with 100% inflation every year. The climate changes, right? But it's not the same to have a 0.3% of inflation than to have 100% every year. And this is what's happening with climate change. The rate is so high, the animals don't have time to evolve. Not physically. We might have animals like killer whales who can adapt. They say, well, okay, now I need to eat something else. But other animals might not be able to do this.
I think many times it's hard to strike a balance, right? Because I think that there are many problems. Obviously, climate change is a big problem. And almost in some ways, climate change is too broad a term. I think there are very specific components of it that are challenges that should be addressed. But I do think it's important, and I think it's helpful to recognize and highlight the work people do and the advancements that have been made, and the fact that because of many of the political campaigns and social campaigns and things like that have made awareness. I mean, there's probably no one on the planet at this point that doesn't know about climate change. I think that it's good to highlight, okay, well, what are people doing? There's plenty of hardworking people that are in many big groups, and a lot of money poured into it, that are trying to really do it pragmatically of how to fix very specific things. So hopefully, there's always going to be problems, but I think that I think having a balance, right, of okay, some serious issues, but here's the things that are being done and continue to be done, and okay, how do we keep working towards that? I want to ask about again, just you personally. So you do all this great research, and you've done a lot of great research. I believe you also have a blog, and you like to communicate about science as well. Is this true? Tell us about that part of you, or other aspects of yourself that you want to share. But that's also important in communicating these things well, and doing this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I would mention definitions again, because you were saying about climate change. If we want to solve a problem, you need to define exactly what the problem is and work towards that. When we have definitions like climate change, which is so big, so I would encourage anybody listening that look at problems they want to solve. If they want to do something for the climate, just figure out what the problem is and what the solution is. We need to have a message that says, this is a problem and this is the solution. This is what we need to do. And with that, we can, as alone, we're not going to do much, but we can put pressure, and we go to the politicians with this is the solution for this particular problem. Then we see the rest. I do have a website called Porpoise Lady .org. I have my Twitter as well, Porpoise Lady. And it's dedicated to harbor porpoises specifically, because, porpoise love needs to be given. But there's a lot about my research as well, my different projects. And the idea is to interview researchers that work with harbor porpoises all around the world once in a while, and then also write blogs about either papers that I read or things that I'm interested in. I used to have a blog more personal, and there's still some of them there that they can read, but I don't do those personal. Not for now, at least.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I think it's wonderful what you're doing in terms of your own research, and then trying to communicate as well. I think that those things are super important. I think for many, I think more, the more I talk to people, the more I think many researchers realize this now, which is really, in all fields really, which is encouraging, is to take things from academia and to say, okay, how do we share this with a popular audience in a way that is accurate, but is also, practical and tangible, and people can understand it. And, in a way, science doesn't really matter if you can't explain it in a way for people to understand and for people to use it. And so I think it's great that you try to do that and other people do that. I think that's really wonderful. So, you've listed the website. Is there anywhere else that people can find you, or anywhere else they can find your work or your research?
Yeah, so having said that about science communication, I also wrote a paper against asking scientists to do science communication. And the reason is because I think some people are good at this and they can do a really good job. Some people are really good scientists and they shouldn't be talking to the public because it could be bad for the scientific community in general if they don't know, they don't have the social skills, so they need to do good science communication. I think we need to collaborate to do this. There's people who are actually really good at science communication. We shouldn't be all trying to do our stuff.
Yes, I would agree with that. Yes, I would agree with that.
And so, yeah, I wrote a paper about this, and hopefully we'll get into at least the marine mammal community. They already have some really good people doing science communication instead of just having everybody attempting to tell the public. Yeah, so I have my Twitter is Porpoise Lady, or my personal Twitter, which is Melanthropic, with a H there somewhere. And yeah, that's about that. I have all my publications are on my website; they're all available. And there's this new one coming out of the dolphin speaking with the porpoise.
Nice.
I shouldn't say that. The dolphin making porpoise sounds.
Yes. And I also agree with you. I don't think everyone that does science or research should be communicating. I think there's, not everyone's built for that, and that's totally fine. I think just in the general abstract, I think you should do it, and I agree. There should be a collaborative work, and there should be collaboration across disciplines, which is, I think, an important thing to do as well. Again, not everyone has to do that, but I think that there should be some kind of interactions, especially within disciplines as well. All the subfields, people should talk to each other a little bit more. So,
yes, we wrote this in the context of early career researchers, because there's a lot expected of us. We need to do fieldwork and research and teaching and analysis and programming and science communication.
It's a lot.
It's like,
it's a lot.
And so we need to collaborate.
Yeah, that's right. Well, this is so much fun to talk with you, Mel. I blinked and it was almost 2 hours. It's so much fun to talk with you about your stuff and about your research, and I can't say enough thanks to you for taking your time and talking with me about all the things that you're passionate about and all the things you're working on.
My pleasure. Thank you.